Good afternoon. It's good to see everybody here this afternoon. Can people in the rear hear? Is the volume okay? Good. If I trail off, just tell me to up the volume and I'll do my best. In any case, I'm David Lampton, Senior Research Fellow at the SAIS Foreign Policy Institute, and it's good to be back at SAIS where I spent so many happy years. I really love SAIS and SAIS students and my colleagues as well. So it's great to be here on this very special occasion. Welcome to the 11th Nancy Bernkopf Tucker Memorial Lecture, a series established by her late husband, Professor Warren I. Cohen, a notable diplomatic historian in his own right. Our esteemed speaker for this year's lecture is research professor at the University of California, San Diego, Susan L. Shirk. She'll be properly introduced shortly. Dr. Shirk's presence here today attests to the personal and professional admiration in and out of government that academe and government hold for Nancy Tucker. She passed away in 2012 and served as a preeminent diplomatic historian at Georgetown University from 1987 until her passing. She wrote classics on the U.S.-China-Taiwan interaction and the diplomats who have tried to manage those relationships. Her final book, published in 2012, was entitled The China Threat, Memories, Myths, and Realities in the 1950s. Separate from this memorial lecture series, Columbia University Press, Columbia being Dr. Tucker's alma mater for a PhD, established the Nancy Bernkopf Tucker and Warren I. Cohen series on American and East Asian relations. That series was established in 2016. For those of you in the audience who may not have had the good fortune to know Nancy, I want to call particular attention to two prominent features of her life and her work beyond her research and teaching contributions. These are features that are of special meaning at this fragile moment in our national life. First, Nancy believed that scholars not only should produce knowledge, but also should endeavor to convey policy-relevant findings to their fellow citizens and policymakers. Nancy believed both of the feasibility and necessity of improving public discourse and policy making. To those ends, she was active in non-governmental organizations and public education, believing that governments and citizens were capable of self-improvement. Second, Nancy Tucker believed in service, punctuating her academic career with important periods in the United States government, notably being awarded the National Intelligence Medal in 2007. Nancy was the first Assistant Deputy Director of National Intelligence for analytic integrity and standards. And she was also Analytic Ombudsman in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. These titles signify that she was an important guardian of the integrity of the intelligence community analytic processes during part of the George W. Bush administration. I, for one, wish she was still holding these responsible positions. Her Washington Post obituary reported her to have said that her job in the government was to provide, quote, a release mechanism, end quote, for intelligence officers feeling pressured to reach certain conclusions in their work. Nancy's life work embodied 4 core values: knowledge, service, public education, and integrity. Now I want to invite Jessica Chen Weiss, Professor of China Studies and Director of the Institute of America, China, and the Future of Global Affairs here at SAIS, to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Susan Shirk. Susan and Nancy Tucker share many of the same dimensions of their personality and career, and I'm so glad you came, Susan.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's my great honor to be here at SAIS as the David M. Lampton Chair of China Studies. So really wonderful to follow Mike in introducing tonight's lecture. Susan Shirk is a research professor at the UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy and the Director Emeritus of its 21st Century China Center, a leading light in connecting scholarship and policy on this critical topic. She is one of the most influential experts working on U.S.-China relations and Chinese politics. And I am incredibly fortunate to have worked with Susan at UC San Diego. She was my doctoral dissertation advisor and the reason who I am today. And so it's really such a privilege to welcome you here to SAIS, Susan. Susan's experience with China dates back to her first visit to China in 1971, and she has been researching, teaching, and engaging with China diplomatically ever since. She also held a distinguished career in public service. She, from 1997 to 2000, served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs. And, of course, is an incredibly renowned scholar. Her most recent book, Overreach, How China Derailed Its Peaceful Rise, won the prestigious Gelber Prize. The jury described its masterful analysis as provocative, plausible, and full of pragmatic potential for policymakers. And not content with analysis, Susan also co-chairs a task force of China experts, some of whom are here today, that has issued important reports, including course correction toward an effective and sustainable China policy. And she also co-chairs, not least, the UC San Diego Forum on U.S.-China Relations, which also convenes now Washington China Forum, one of the really preeminent and first ongoing high-level forums focused entirely on this critical relationship. It's really a great honor and a privilege, Susan, to be here and to welcome you today to provide your assessment of how Chinese politics today, including changes in U.S. politics, are likely to shape U.S.-China relations and prospects for coexistence to come. Thank you.
So it is really a deep honor and privilege and joy for me to have the opportunity to deliver this lecture in honor of Nancy Bernkopf Tucker. And I'm thinking also about Warren Cohen, who had been in touch with me to organize the lecture over quite a long period of time. It was postponed because of the shuttering of the Wilson Center, and we're very grateful that SAIS took us in. And it's also, of course, just wonderful to see a lot of old friends from old China hands and to reflect on Nancy Tucker's legacy and where we are today. Coming down on the train from New York, I reread her last book about Eisenhower and Dulles, and there China policy, and I really recommend that we all pick it up and reread it because it's very relevant to the situation today. It turns out that, who knew, I had sort of skimmed the book, but I hadn't really read it deeply, that Eisenhower had kind of two faces of China policy. He had a public Cold War face, and he had internal point of view about China, which was much more pragmatic and anticipated a diplomatic relationship between China and the United States and China's rise, economic rise at least in the future as well. So the pressures of domestic politics operating on Dwight Eisenhower forced him into a position that he didn't entirely really believe himself. So today, I'd like to reflect on the question of leaders, individual leaders. And, you know, for most of my career as a China scholar, China has really been a very positive story. People's living standards improved. China developed a commercialized media and greater freedom of information. People started traveling and studying abroad. The Communist Party established a collective leadership system with peaceful transfer of power at the top. And China's modernization seemed to be working its magic. China's relations with the United States also improved despite the vast differences in our political systems and China's rapid rise as an economic and military power that challenged American primacy. And I credit skillful diplomacy by both governments. Chinese leaders pursued a policy of restraint to reassure its neighbors, the United States and other countries, that it was a responsible power with friendly intentions. I'm looking at Ken Lieberthal, who served in the Clinton administration with me, and I know that both of us were gratified but also somewhat amused that some of the ways that we described our goals for China were then picked up in Chinese rhetoric, and they repeated it to endorse their goals as becoming a responsible power. And of course, the US welcomed China into international institutions, offering it a seat at the head table. And I was just saying to Jessica as we drove in here that it really is an impressive fact that over 8 Democratic and Republican administrations, presidents actively engaged with Beijing in diplomatic efforts to induce China to act responsibly and to weave a fabric of cooperation between the two societies. During this long period of studying and working on China, I would never have predicted our current situation. China is once again being ruled by a concentrated personalistic leadership, similar to Mao, but so is the US. And the relationship between the two countries has become dangerously adversarial. Now, most international relations scholars see the hostility between China and the United States as structural, the inevitable clash of a rising and established power. Mira Rapp-Hooper put it this way in her recent Foreign Affairs article, "Structure Trump's agency in the US-China relationship." She said, "The laws of international relations are ruthless. No matter what happens at the meeting between the two leaders in Korea, China's ambitions will still pose the same long-term risks to American interests, American allies, and American power." Well, I'm not an international relations expert. I'm a comparative politics scholar, and I see history, as Nancy Tucker did, and she was a historian, as more contingent on human agency, particularly on domestic politics within countries. Who are the people who make the crucial decisions, and what is the nature of leadership? Having watched China change so drastically over the past half century in ways that I could never have imagined, makes me see the future as well as much more open-ended than many other China international relations experts do. And so today I'm focusing on one type of leadership, centralized, personalistic leaders like Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. As the late political scientist Joe Nye argued, there usually is ample room for maneuver between countries to avert war. And I love the fact that I went back to reread some of Joe Nye's work recently, not just because sadly he passed away, but also because the editor of Caixin Media, my friend Wang Shuo, wrote a wonderful column paying tribute to Joe Nye when he passed away. I particularly love it when my Chinese friends and colleagues bring to my attention work that's been written by Western scholars that I may have not paid ample attention to. So I went back to read Joe Nye's piece in International Security, Inevitability and War. He argued that many of the misjudgments that human beings make are avoidable, but over time, the funnel of choice can narrow. The decision-making space shrinks as events progress and options are foreclosed. Wars are caused not by necessity, but by accumulated misjudgment. History is path-dependent, he wrote. Events close in over time, degrees of freedom are lost, and the probability of war increases. But the funnel of choices might open up to leaders, might open up again, and degrees of freedom be regained. This is the lens through which I've been observing the interactions between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. Research generally finds that personalistic political systems tend to be more war-prone than systems that have multiple centers of power that check one another. But as I watched the manner in which Xi Jinping was dealing with Trump's trade war, and the way President Trump had, with great impetuousness, shifted his policies, I started to see how the convergence of China and the United States toward personalistic strongman rule might paradoxically open up possibilities for stabilizing relations through mutual compromise and therefore buying time for diplomacy to work. In other words, I started thinking that maybe these two personalistic leaders are opening up the funnel of choice. And because concentrated leadership creates possibilities for mutual compromise, freeing the leader from the constraints of powerful interest groups, and allowing them sometimes to make terrible mistakes, misjudgments, but other times maybe breaking through the deadlock, the domestic political deadlock, to make compromises needed for two powerful countries like China and the United States to figure out how to coexist. But I also realize that having two personalistic leaders increases the fragility of any agreements that they may conclude, because if these agreements depend entirely on their personal dispositions and are not undergirded by some broad foundation of stakeholders. So there needs to be a foundation. You need to bring the rest of the society on board, but the first steps may be easier when it's two personalistic leaders dealing with one another. Personalistic political systems with few constraints on the top leader and few rules typically don't produce good governance or rapid economic growth or peace. But we have, under certain circumstances, see them produce rapid economic growth for a time, as in China under Deng Xiaoping, Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew, South Korea under Park Chung-hee, Indonesia under Suharto. So maybe the way to think about it is that personalistic political systems lead to greater variance in economic performance. And maybe they also lead to greater variance in war and peace. The range of outcomes is much wider. So you can have what Francis Fukuyama called a bad emperor problem, a personalistic leader with bad judgment, but by giving leaders more discretion, greater freedom of action, it can give them the latitude to make the compromises necessary for successful bargaining. And that's what I observe might be happening under Xi and Trump. At their recent meeting in South Korea at the margin of the APEC summit, they unwound the sanctions they had imposed on one another, restoring the status quo before the trade war and establishing a truce that should last 1 year. So what they've done is buy a year for diplomacy to work. There's a tentative plan for Trump to go to China in April of next year, and for Xi Jinping to visit the United States probably in the summer of 2026. And this game plan, if it holds, will give plenty of time for the professionals in the two governments to put the hours in to discussing and negotiating the deliverables that each of them hopes to produce by means of these meetings. You could say that US-China relations have to get really bad before the two sides get so worried about the risk of war that they buckle down to the hard work of stabilizing relations. That was my experience when I went into the Clinton administration in 1997 after the Taiwan Strait crisis, when Lee Teng-hui had visited his alma mater, Cornell, to give a speech. China launched missiles that closed Taiwan ports, and there were massive PRC military exercises around Taiwan. But following that crisis, we had this exchange of presidential visits. Jiang Zemin came to the United States in October of '97, and President Clinton visited China in the summer of 1998. Planning those state visits required hours of diplomacy to negotiate them. And the specific deliverables that each side wanted to achieve, in my experience, were less significant in themselves than in the pragmatism and mutual respect that developed between the professional diplomats in the two countries. It's conceivable that that kind of re-engagement could occur during 2026. The outcome is not likely to be a grand bargain covering the full agenda of issues in US-China relations. Security issues like nuclear arms control, maritime and air incursions in the South China Sea and against Japan and Taiwan, cyber attacks, structural economic reform, law enforcement, climate change, science and technology, people-to-people exchanges. The agenda for US-China relations is very wide and very full. But planning these state visits will require both governments to set some concrete priority objectives, make compromises to get some results so that they can then show their publics that their leaders' approach that will be combining engagement with competition is working. The process is also likely to produce some positive spillovers into the relations between the two societies. On the US side, we already see from polls by Pew and the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, taken even before the Xi-Trump encounter, that views of Americans, particularly Democrats, are growing less negative toward China. Public opinion follows what the politicians say and do. It had gotten very negative after hearing from both Republican and Democratic politicians, especially the presidents, about the China threat. Trump's friendly words and gestures, which sound to some ears a little silly, a little overblown, but may actually really appeal to the personalistic leader on the other side of the table. And they may open up some space for reasoned debate on the costs and benefits of different approaches to China policy. The so-called bipartisan consensus on the China threat may be breaking up. Democrats and younger voters no longer view China as an enemy, and the cost of tariffs is causing the public to divide on China policy. Of course, the farmers didn't like the tariffs, and it's pretty clear that the goal of soybean purchases influenced Trump probably more than any other issue in his willingness to make compromises at the meeting with Xi Jinping in Korea. Because, and this is sort of right out of Mansur Olson, right? Concentrated costs, the political pressure of these groups could cause the Republicans to lose farm states in the 2026 midterm election. As of yet, I don't see any sign that public opinion on the Chinese side is becoming more divided or more positive to the United States. Instead, the public is rallying around the flag, becoming depressingly anti-American, blaming the US for everything that's going wrong in China. As one journalist said to me, I just came back from spending 5 weeks in China. One journalist said to me, nothing has actually changed with us, but by comparison with Trump, we seem to be doing better. So the Chinese feel better about themselves from the top to the bottom. When people see the American president breaking norms and laws to decimate the so-called deep state, it looks to them like America's cultural revolution. So the things going on in the United States are making Xi Jinping look better to his public in China. And what I found on this visit was even my liberal intellectual friends and private business people who just 6 or 12 months before were very, very critical of Xi Jinping, now they feel kind of proud of the way that Xi Jinping has stood up to Donald Trump. China was the only country in the world with the scale and determination to retaliate against the Trump trade war and to drive the two countries into diplomatic engagement. So the Chinese public seems quite unified, although who knows, this is based on a little more than talk with taxi drivers, but not a whole lot more. So we don't have surveys about this, but the public seems, and my hunch is, this is the way it feels to me intuitively, that they seem more unified between Xi's approach to the US than the US public is toward Trump's approach to China. So, over the next year, if the two sides can find ways to make progress in the negotiations and the build-up to the leaders' meetings, then I predict that public views will surely become warmer toward one another. But then the question is, can agreements between these two personalistic leaders create greater predictability and certainty? I mean, they each of them has their own reasons to negotiate, but without a broad foundation of other stakeholders, any agreement between them will be very fragile. They both have shown that they can react emotionally and turn on a dime to scapegoat and punish the other side. Also, all agreements are vulnerable to being condemned as appeasement, capitulation. We see a lot of this criticism in the American media already now. So to build support for diplomatic re-engagement, the leaders will have to make the case for it publicly. Will Trump and the Republicans do that in the lead up to the midterm election? Will Democrats campaign against Trump for being too soft on China, even though the polls show that actually Democrats are less negative toward China than the Republicans? So this is really a rather complex equation of the two-level games between domestic electoral politics and the negotiations between China and the United States. Let me mention very quickly a few of the, let's see, how are we doing on time? I could stop right there. Or more? Okay. Well, 5 minutes, okay. Maybe I'll take those 5 minutes to say how impressed I've been with the discipline that Xi Jinping has shown in his reaction to the Trump trade war. I was really surprised by this because Xi Jinping has been a kind of erratic, volatile, personalistic leader for the 10 plus years he's been in office. And there are many examples of that in my book, Overreach, of sudden shifts in policy that she seems to have decided on because decision-making was so highly concentrated. He was not listening to advice from expert technocrats. The circle of his personal advisors had become quite small, and he was reacting somewhat erratically. And of course, the shift in the zero COVID policy is the most dramatic example of that kind of reversal. And so when Trump came into office and started by imposing the Liberation Day tariffs, which were draconian, it was interesting that she seemed so well prepared. Now, of course, he had had 4 years of Donald Trump in the first Trump administration. And so he came into office prepared to negotiate with a whole game plan for negotiation, but also prepared to retaliate. And had prepared also by stockpiling commodities and other things, prepared for the struggle that he believed would ensue if he did retaliate. And when you look at the way that he has retaliated, it's striking how commensurate they are and we can get into the rare earths licensing regime, because in a way that was the one move that was more than commensurate. But up until that time, everything was commensurate. Everything was structured in the same way as the US measure, and it was very carefully called a countermeasure, not an aggressive act in and of itself. When I was in China recently, I met with a Chinese foreign ministry official, pretty senior person, and I had an excellent, very frank conversation with him. It was right after the licensing regime on the rare earths had been introduced, and the criticism was coming from the world that, my goodness, if China expects to be able to say thumbs up or thumbs down to every trade of every product that has 1% of Chinese materials in it, this was beyond expansive. This was outrageous, and it got not just the United States, but other countries and other businesses very upset as well. So what I said to this foreign ministry official, I said, this is not sustainable. This move is absolutely not sustainable. And he responded to me, he acknowledged that that was the case. In fact, he said, well, yeah, we're not stupid. Which said to me that there was never any plan to actually use this right now. This was going to be used as a bargaining chip in the negotiation with Trump to try to get Trump to call off the measures that the Chinese found unacceptable. Also, I found the way the TikTok thing was handled was also very impressive, because they understood, that Xi Jinping understood that for reasons that are somewhat inexplicable, this mattered so much to Donald Trump that he had his representatives, cabinet officers, spending 4 days in negotiation with China on how to structure the TikTok deal. And the Chinese sort of cooled off the issue, and by saying this is a business transaction. Earlier, they had said this is a matter of principle. They walked away from that and said, this is a business transaction and we won't get in the way, basically. So these disciplined and, I would say, and pragmatic and effective approaches of combining diplomacy with retaliation was really quite impressive. It involved risks. It definitely involved taking risks. And the licensing regime for the rare earths was taking a risk of escalation, for sure. But Xi Jinping was willing to take the strategic risk. So what happens next? I don't have a whole lot of confidence that this will be a very durable arrangement. As Besant, I believe, said today, you know, we anticipate this is going to be a kind of annual, we have to renew the deal, extend the mutual punishments on an annual basis. But my belief is that by buying time for diplomacy to work, getting the professionals from the two sides together, I believe I just read yesterday that they're creating a working group on fentanyl that will be talking about enforcement. You know, you get the professionals from the two sides together. Both countries, both governments will have to decide what they want to achieve in the way of deliverables in those leaders' meetings. Even being forced to do that, it has a positive effect to clarify to the other side what your priority objectives are. And I think that if this can be done in a way that also generates some goodwill between the two governments, between the two personalistic leaders, it will spill over into public views of one another. And on the other hand, it could blow up any moment because we have these two personalistic leaders. Donald Trump particularly is a volatile personality, but Xi Jinping also acted quite erratically in the past. And so the whole thing could definitely self-destruct. But what I'm looking for now is indications that the two leaders will defend their approach to one another publicly and try to build the kind of foundation of support in their two economies, their two societies, to sustain this period of diplomatic re-engagement. Thank you very much.
Are we on to the mics here? It sounds like we are. Well, let me join my colleagues in welcoming you here. It is always a treat. It's a special treat for me. I've learned more working with you and from you over the years than almost anybody about China. I've had some great mentors, and some of them are in the room here today. But you have been first among equals, and so I'm really grateful for you sharing this with us and being with us here at SAIS. I want to start on your last point, right, which is the sort of you've got your two paths, the happy path and the less optimistic one, and have a reputation for being more on the dark side, as you know. So, I mean, the two other things that worry me, get your reaction to it, is one, you know, you talk about having the sort of the working level engagement, sort of building the foundations for the next steps. How much should we be concerned? After all, if you look at the people in the administration, with the exception of the president himself, none of them have positive views of China, and they all came in as, you know, real China hawks. I mean, Rubio, Bridge, Vance, others. How much should we worry that when left alone, even understanding that Trump wants this thing, that their own sort of skepticism, their own kind of view about this will sort of undermine the possibilities of that? That's the first question. And the second is, how much is the, you know, we've often, you and I and others, have always believed that without sort of a deep understanding about this, the long-term strategic relationship with China, that these transactional things are very fragile, right? So those are how would you respond about those two risks to the possibility of taking this forward?
Well, I mean, I share obviously I share the worry. And if you read Superpower Showdown, great book on U.S.-China relations by Bob Davis and Ling Wei, you see that the first Trump administration, things were smooth, more or less smooth, until the midterm. Then when Trump did badly and he got worried about re-election, he gave the go-ahead to the hawks in the administration, and they went wild. So that same thing could happen here, even though he's not running for re-election himself, but I'm sure he still cares about who wins the election. So after the midterm, that could happen. That's definitely one scenario. On the other hand, I remember many years ago in the Bush administration when President Bush stood up with Wen Jiabao. Okay, well, the puzzle, as I was observing it, was why did the neocons never get their teeth into China policy in the Bush administration? And so I asked my friend, wise man, the late Arnie Cantor, why have the neocons not gotten their teeth into China policy? He said, Susan, what you have to understand is even in a kind of pluralistic government like we have, when the president stands up and publicly takes a position, then everybody else in the administration falls in line. So when he stood up and said to Wen Jiabao, he criticized Chen Shui-bian's plan for a referendum, and the Chinese premier Wen Jiabao was here, so he did that publicly, criticizing Taiwan, and that sent the message: don't mess around with Taiwan and China policy. And so neocons were doing other things, but they didn't do China. So I wouldn't underestimate the ability of President Trump if he cares enough. I don't really know if he cares enough about making China a big success for his administration. If he cares enough, though, he could control the other folks in his administration. And it could also, one thing, this is not your question, but it's a little bit related, which is if you look at the relationship of the tariff levels on China and the other countries, and China's a really high priority for Trump, then he's going to have to adjust the tariffs on these other countries, because you can't have the tariff on China be so much lower than the tariff on friendly countries. So you're going to have to adjust all these tariffs, actually. And maybe it could trigger the unwinding of the whole reciprocal tariff thing.
And on strategic engagement, can this survive at the transactional level where they're doing deals on fentanyl and doing deals on soybeans without some broader understanding about what the relationship is?
I believe yes. I know we always say China really cares about the principles. We have to talk about the principle, the framework for the relationship first, and then we have to get down to the specific things we want to accomplish. But we always say that's from the Chinese side, that they're the ones who really care about the principles. And I think when you have relations, when they deteriorate to such an extent, you're not going to get agreement on what is the essence, the nature, of the relationship. I think what you're going to do is you have to make some progress though. So far, we've just been unwinding bad stuff. But you need to make some progress in doing good stuff, not just unwinding bad stuff. But I don't think we have to have a grand vision of what the relationship is.
I mean, I just wonder, and I'll move on, whether when you do it this way, whether you're always at risk of having balloons flying overhead and knocking the whole thing off course.
Well, I mean, of course, you can agree up front of what you're going to do the next time something like that happens and try to sustain the positive momentum. So I think you can do that sort of operationally without doing it in a philosophical way.
Good. I loved your analogy about the funnels for coming off Joe's piece. And I want to talk about two funnels and wonder whether you think they're opening or closing. The first funnel is Ukraine, right? Which is the question about how important we now see. Trump obviously is desperate to get an agreement. He thinks this will solidify his Nobel Peace Prize for sure. And he seems to have turned against Putin as sort of now seeing Putin as the obstacle. Of course, the Chinese are deeply implicated on this thing. Does it, in terms of the funnel opening, is it important to keeping that funnel open for the Chinese to respond in any way on this? Or can we continue to live in a world in which part of what's helping Putin carry on is the continued support that he's getting from China?
Well, I was really discouraged to see that in China this time, the support for Russia has grown. And so my theory of the situation had been that this was Xi and Putin, this was a personal, bromance, and because I knew for so many years that people in China don't really like or trust Russia. They're bitter about a lot of things from the history with Russia. But this time, of course, there's been a lot of propaganda on the nightly news, but I think that basically your enemy's enemy is my friend. So people are so kind of hurt and upset by what America's been doing to China that they are getting closer to Russia. Even people who don't really feel any great affinity for Russia, but they're more sympathetic to Russia as somehow having been the victim of pressures, NATO, and pressures from the West.
So the second funnel is Taiwan. You won't be surprised in this context that we should talk about this. It seems like this is a classic case of the funnel closing over recent years, right? And that as the United States has gotten closer to Taiwan and increased the level of engagement and the support and the sort of coming up against increasingly active efforts by the PRC to put the pressure on, and with the election of the DPP and William Lai, does this now this rapprochement between the United States and China reopen a funnel, or are we still going down in this closing window in which the prospects look tense?
Well, if you look at the rare earths licensing regime as an example of kind of overshooting, little bit overshooting, because China did get this backlash and it was very effective. And it will continue to be effective for quite some time. But in terms of judgment in this bargaining game, it was a little much. And you could get some of the same problems with Taiwan, I think. I tend to believe that, meaning if they really push Trump hard to sell out Taiwan in some way, that would be very much overshooting. And they could definitely do that. Insist on Trump saying, we oppose Taiwan independence. If they don't do that, and they simply insist on no more encouragement in various symbolic ways of the DPP effort to establish de facto independence more. I think that would be, I think that Trump would be willing to commit not to continue to do that. In other words, exercise self-restraint when it comes to supporting Taiwan, while continuing to build up the deterrence posture with Japan and other countries. So I think you could split that difference, you know what I mean? You could, so I don't think it would be viewed by Trump as selling out Taiwan, not to have him visit and things like that.
But to think about it in terms of Xi's own perspectives, I mean, and you know.
What he has to achieve.
Right, yeah.
Well, all I can tell you is that what I heard from people when I was there recently was they told me honestly that there was kind of a war scare in China, that they were really worried about the possibility of war over Taiwan up until about 8-10 months ago. And now they feel more relaxed about it. They don't think that Xi is going to do anything. They feel that Trump is taking the right position on Taiwan. And so they are just more relaxed about the risk of military confrontation in the Strait. And I think part of it is also the amazingly unprecedented stuff that's going on with the purges in the military. So, you know, people don't talk about it too much, but people are aware of it. And they draw the conclusion that Trump probably has less confidence in his military and therefore not willing to take the risk of using it in a Taiwan contingency.
So let's lead into what I want to ask, my last one from you, and then I really want to give the audience a chance, which is you can't get away from these conversations, especially when you talk about political leadership without talking about Xi's future, right? And so give us the usual and the perspective of how to think about this. We haven't seen any signs of anointing a successor and the like, but how do you think that, I mean, I know they had this great conversation about immortality, but I assume that even Xi doesn't think that he's going to be. What's the thinking, do you think?
Well, you hear a lot more rumors about retired leaders being very unhappy about the situation. And I mean, this is pure rumor stuff, but you're hearing more of it. And, you know, people like Li Ruihuan are only 91. Really, I started looking up how old all these people are. You know, and these are people who were Hu Yaobang liberals. liberal, democratic, socialist, Leninist, whatever. And then people also talk about the possibility of having some successors named at the 21st Party Congress. So that doesn't mean stepping down necessarily, but it means that producing a arrangement for succession after the fourth term. That's progress, I
I
guess.
guess. All right, let me open it up to the audience here. Right in the front. Here.
Susan, as a non-expert on foreign policy, especially on China, I just wondered if you'd comment on this. It's been my observation that people in America have learned, through these negotiations that have gone on so far, have learned an awful lot about how much we need China. We depend on China. We can't just tell them to go jump in the lake. Even if we want to have more manufacturing here, it's going to be a long time. I didn't know that all of Apple's computers are made in China. I didn't know about the rare earths thing. And so I'm wondering whether that you think that that's a factor in creating some stability in this improvement process.
Well, definitely interdependence and awareness of interdependence is a force for greater stability. And I don't know what are the implications from the standpoint of how the policy elite or the public views the relationship with China then. Does it make people see them as more of a threat, or that we need to somehow work together to, not harm ourselves more? We've had this strategic competition framework now for almost 10 years. And I think it's really the way people are thinking about the relationship with China. And I don't know whether or not people can shift to a more positive view of interdependence, or do they see interdependence as vulnerability? It's mutual vulnerability. So, a lot of people have sort of given up on the possibility of coexistence. So can they get back to thinking that we need to find a way to peacefully coexist? I don't know. This is why I mentioned that the leader really has to sell the policy. You have to explain to people, this is what we're doing, this is what we're trying to do. And whether or not it can be done in the Trump administration, I don't know.
Just on the selling of the policy, so I'm again thinking about the Chinese side. One thing that was very striking when she came to San Francisco, that it seemed like it was combined with some selling back home when he was talking about World War II and the cooperation. Do you see any sign of this now, that in the lead up to the meeting with Trump, that he was laying the groundwork for a positive outcome and getting support for that?
Yeah, actually, if you just look at the rhetoric, it's pretty positive. And certainly what he said to Trump that was played up around about China's development can help make America great again. That's interesting. And for one thing, I hope this means maybe that one of the areas that we square the circle and try to shift to a more positive approach is through Chinese investment in the United States, which I think could help a lot.
I'm a little worried about that when I've been told my router is not safe anymore because it's controlled by China. But if TP-Link isn't good enough, are we really going to do investment here? Anyway, other questions from the audience? Let's start right here. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. And then you can pass it over right down the after you go. Yeah.
Hi, Doctor. Thanks for coming to SAIS. I'm Carlo. I'm a second-year MAR student. I'd like to, this may not be your area of expertise, but I'd like to ask something about the observers, basically, of this U.S.-China relations. I'm from the Philippines. We find ourselves kind of entangled with this U.S.-China confrontation. We also have a history of highly personalized political leadership directing foreign relations. But I'd like to ask, given this dynamic between Xi and President Trump, what advice would you say, not just to the Philippines, but all these countries in the Indo-Pacific that may be on the fence on whether to work more closely with the United States or react more or try to side more with China? What would you advise given this dynamic between both countries?
Well, it definitely is not my area of expertise. And I think our friends and allies and other Asian countries in particular are in a really difficult position. And just as the law firms are, the universities are, basically this kind of bullying behavior and extortion by the president puts every institution, every government in an impossible situation. So I have no advice. I really respect how hard these decisions are, and I think we should be forgiving of pretty much anything that people do.
Okay, right next to.
Hello, Dr. Shirk. Thank you so much for being here with us. My name is Naja Blackwell, and I'm a second-year MAIR student here. And my question was you talked about reflecting on the leadership in the upcoming year with both diplomats and negotiators getting ready to go in the room and kind of lay the groundwork for the next 10 years or so of U.S.-China relations. What do you see the compromises and concessions being on both sides that could come out of this year of work, especially with Taiwan being a big flashpoint in that? What do you think are some key compromises or concessions that, not just from the U.S. side, but also from the China side, that could come from this year of deliberation, for lack of better words. And how do you see that moving our relationship either forward or backward, and especially with the presidential leadership that we have now?
Well, I think a lot of the focus will be on the economic relationship and on technology. And because now technology is on the table, and which doesn't bother me, but it does bother a lot of other people who insist, it's all about security and we don't negotiate about our security. So Taiwan, if there is a negotiation over Taiwan and the U.S. commits to do certain things that Beijing would like them to do, like not do certain things in terms of visits, symbolic stuff, largely, visits, and this kind of thing. I think the United States should try to get Beijing to also commit the way it uses force against Taiwan. Crossing the midline, it's, the military pressure on Taiwan, like the military pressure on Japan and the Philippines and others, those things should be on the table too. Now, the Chinese will come back to us and they will ask us to reduce our ship activity and plane activity around the periphery of China. I think all of those things are important security issues to China and, probably will and can be on the table. Other issues I think we can make progress on. Let's bring Fulbright back, maybe Peace Corps, definitely the physical safety of visitors and the treatment of visitors back and forth from each guy. I mean, there are a lot of irritants in the relationship now that need to be negotiated. And then there are so many things that we should be doing jointly together related to, of course, the problem is on climate, look at the policy of this administration on climate and energy. It's really very difficult to work on that together with China.
One more. Is there anybody, I don't want to get people out of the back. So let's go, I'll take two, one here and one there, and then take them together, and that'll wrap us up.
Good evening, ma'am. I'm Ben Brennick. I am a MIPP student and active duty Space Force officer. I was curious on what you thought the impact would be if the NDS, National Defense Strategy, and National Security Strategy were altered to no longer prioritize global power competition, instead homeland defense, and how that would be seen by the Chinese.
And said what?
Homeland defense. Homeland.
Oh.
You've seen the reports that, the National Defense Strategy is going to focus on hemispheric and homeland defense.
Yeah.
Rather,
You want to take the other question?
Right
Jen?
there. Take the other question and go ahead.
I'm Fraser Stevens. I'm a Fulbright scholar here at SAIS. With so many brilliant China scholars in the room, I was reminded of the Washington Post article by Fravo et al. China is not an enemy. It was from 2019. So if that's the consensus among China scholars, who or which actors cemented this perception of China as an enemy in your view?
Well, first of all, I'm going to take that one first. Forgive me. China's own behavior, its own actions in the South China Sea, military pressure toward its neighbors, domestic policies in Xinjiang, Tibet, the end of this more open period of media, internet, steps toward greater freedom. There are a lot of things that China did that made it appear more threatening to Americans and people in other countries as well. And of course, one thing I should probably have mentioned is that personalistic leaders in themselves always end up looking more threatening, right? Because we can vilify, Hitler, Stalin, Xi Jinping. Nobody really vilified Hu Jintao, who led a collective leadership. So, I think that also, so it's not just American domestic politics that leads to these threat perceptions. It's China's own actions as well. And then, as I said, you have a Republican president, a Democratic president, another Republican president, and they're all sort of saying the same thing about China as a security threat and an economic threat, and people are gonna adopt that kind of framework. As to this idea of a hemispheric foreign policy, I mean, isn't this basically just isolationism? Isn't it just a form of isolationism that America is going to pull back from the rest of
But
the world?
some people have argued that it's more of a spheres of influence approach. So it's not isolationism per se, but it's sort of carving up the world.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think it would be a major strategic mistake on the part of the administration. But I mean, I do believe that American leadership and foreign policy can be a force for good in the rest of the world. So I wouldn't support that approach myself.
And do you think it would have a significant, I mean, if this would happen, we're obviously speculating, we haven't seen it yet, but I mean, how would this be received in China, and especially by Xi and the leadership?
Oh, they would be jumping up and down with joy. They just say, wow, let's relax, you know, and we get Asia, okay.
But I mean, just it's hard to take this too seriously. But I mean, imagine. I mean, given the volatility they've seen in American policy, I mean, would they see this as just sort of an aberration coming from the president and his current preoccupations, and say, well, you know, but we're not going to count on this because you know we got an next
Yeah,
president.
no, I agree with that. I don't think they would believe this is the America of the future. I mean, they do believe that America's in decline when they look at what's going on here. And this would simply be part of that whole picture. But I think in terms of American foreign policy, I don't think they believe that Americans are going to be satisfied with a hemispheric foreign policy.
All right. On that note, let's ask you all to join me in thanking Susan for a brilliant Nancy Bernkopf Tucker lecture.
Can we have primacy and a hemispheric foreign policy? Primacy?
in the hemisphere, right?
Only in the hemisphere?
It's hard to know. I mean, it's hard to take this seriously, but